During a heated live talk show appearance, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, Ibrahim Traoré, found himself facing unexpected disrespect from a smug and confrontational host. What followed next shocked the entire studio. With sharp words. In commanding presence, Traoré turned the tables live on air, leaving the host stunned and the audience roaring in disbelief. This powerful moment instantly went viral, showcasing to the world his strength, class, and unshakable resolve. It was Monday evening at 6:45 p.m. in Paris, inside Studio 5 of the national TV station. Leo direct, the cameras were rolling, and the crowd was buzzing. Tonight's episode of Favor had been teased for weeks. The guest, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, revolutionary leader and acting president of Burkina Faso. The interview was meant to be a respectful exchange. But behind the scenes, something else was brewing. The host, Marc Delarme, was known for his sharp tongue, smug smirks, and veiled insults, especially toward African leaders. And tonight, he came ready. Traoré walked into the studio calmly, dressed in a modest suit, no flashy pins or decorations, just his usual focused eyes and unshakable posture. He greeted the crew warmly. Marc didn't stand to shake his hand. The red light blinked on. "Good evening, Mr. Traoré," Marc began, his voice cold and condescending. "Should I call you that or a rebel commander?" The audience gasped softly. Ibrahim's face remained still. "Tell me," Marc continued, "do you really believe you have the experience to sit with real-world leaders?" What Marc didn't know was that this night wouldn't go as planned. By the end, it would be Marc, whose career would never recover. The room fell silent. Marc chuckled smugly, as if he had scored a point, and looked into the camera expecting applause, but none came. Ibrahim Traoré leaned back gently, his eyes revealing no anger, only disappointment. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly turned his gaze toward the studio audience. His eyes lingered on a young black girl seated in the front row, eyes wide with hope. Then he spoke. "In my country," he began calmly, "we don't measure a man's worth by how much he wears on his chest, but by how many children sleep safely at night because of him." The room held its breath. Marc shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, you've been accused of," Marc began. But Ibrahim raised his hand politely, not aggressively. "Let me finish," he said, his voice steady. The audience leaned forward, sensing the change in the room. "People like you," Ibrahim said slowly, "think power is wearing a tie in Paris. But real power is standing in front of your people when bullets fly and refusing to run." Gasps echoed through the studio. Marc's lips twitched, unsure of how to react. Ibrahim leaned forward, his voice softer now. "You ask if I belong with world leaders?" he continued. "I ask you, do they belong with their people?" Backstage, the control room was frozen. One producer whispered. He flipped it. Gus eyes. Director stared at the screen in awe. No one dared move. Marc tried to recover, his voice strained. "That's very poetic, President, but poetry doesn't stop terrorists." Ibrahim's jaw tightened slightly, then relaxed. "You're right," he said gently. "Dignity does. Hope does. A leader without hope is more dangerous than any gunman." Then, in a moment that no one expected, he pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is a letter from a 9-year-old girl in Kaya. Her village was attacked. She lost her father, but she still wrote to thank me for protecting her school." Ibrahim paused for a moment. His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the truth of the words he was about to read. He unfolded the letter and began to read it aloud. As he did, the entire audience fell silent, not out of fear, but out of shared pain. By the time he finished, even Marc was speechless. The power of Ibrahim's words and the weight of the letter left everyone in the studio in stunned silence. The truth of the moment was undeniable. This was a turning point, not just for the interview, but for the entire world watching. Ibrahim Traoré, his strength, humility, and unwavering commitment to his people had flipped the script on the interview. It wasn't about insults or confrontation anymore. It was about truth, leadership, and a man who knew the real cost of power. And in that moment, the audience didn't roar with applause. They stood in awe, recognizing that they had just witnessed something far more powerful than any political debate or media spectacle. They had witnessed the true heart of a leader. The cameraman's hands trembled. Mark stared at his notes, completely lost. This wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a reckoning, and it was far from over. The studio had gone silent. Ibrahim sat tall, calm, and unshaken. But you could feel the tension pulsing through the lights and cameras. That's when it happened. A woman in the audience, dark-skinned and softly dressed, stood up. Tears were already streaming down her face. "I know. You," she whispered. "My father used to tell me about leaders like you men who fight for their people, not for money." "Mark," the host tried to cut her off. "Ma'am, this is not the time." But the woman shouted, voice trembling with raw emotion, "You sit there, mocking him, but you don't know what courage looks like. You've never had to protect a village, hold a dying child, or stand alone against the world." The entire room froze. Ibrahim didn't move, his eyes locked with hers, his presence as steady as ever. "You're not just a guest," she said to Ibrahim. "You're hope." That word hope, ... Mark mumbled, now visibly lost. He fidgeted nervously. With his pen, the first time, he realized that this wasn't just politics. Oh, this was pain, history, pride. Something had just awakened a sleeping lion. By dawn, the internet had erupted. TikTok loops, YouTube shorts, Facebook reposts, everyone was sharing the woman's cry, "You're not just a guest, you're hope." The video spread like wildfire in over 100 languages, across thousands of shares. And right beside her in that same clip was Ibrahim Traoré, silent. Steady face, no anger, no clapback, just dignity. In Ouagadougou, students marched peacefully, holding up cardboard signs that read, "Hope wears a uniform. Our voice is no longer silent." At a cafe in Paris, a young boy of African descent watched the clip on his tablet. He turned to his mother and asked, "Is he a king?" She smiled, her eyes full of pride. "No, something better. He's a servant of his people." Meanwhile, Mark's bosses were not smiling. They called an emergency meeting. Sponsors were threatening to walk. Comment sections were brutal. Yet Ibrahim Traoré said nothing. He didn't post, didn't tweet, didn't boast. Because when a lion walks, he doesn't need to roar. The studio called Ibrahim's team. "Please, we need him back. This time, we'll give him a full hour. No interruptions." But the president didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked the streets of Ouagadougou, quietly visiting a refugee shelter. No cameras, no press, just his presence. A little girl ran up and hugged him. They said, "You're like magic," she whispered. Ibrahim knelt down and smiled. "Gently, no, I'm just a man." But magic happens when people believe in each other. That evening, back at his hotel, his assistant handed him the official invitation for the second appearance. Ibrahim read it slowly, then said softly, "Tell them I accept." There was a pause. "But this time, I'll bring my brothers with me." "Which brothers, sir?" the assistant asked. Ibrahim smiled. "The ones whose voices were never invited." The second appearance wasn't just a return. It was a reckoning. This time, Ibrahim didn't walk into the studio alone. Behind him came a silent row of guestmen and women from Africa and the diaspora. A nurse from Bamako, a war orphan from Sudan, a professor from Darfur. Each had their own story, each had been unheard for years. The host, Mark, tried to smile, but his face twitched. The crowd noticed. Ibrahim extended his hand to Mark. "Thank you for inviting us," he said gently. "We've brought some truths with us." There was no anger in his tone, but the air was heavy with the weight of what was to come. As they sat, the cameras rolled, but this time the stage was set for something entirely different, and history began to rewrite itself. The nurse spoke first. She held up a photo of a hospital in Burkina Faso, now reduced to rubble. "Terrorists destroyed this place," she said quietly. "President Traoré sent supplies within 48 hours. He didn't call a press conference, he just acted." Mark blinked. Unsure of what to say, the professor spoke next. "My university was losing funding," he began. President Traoré redirected his own salary for a semester to keep it running. One by one, the stories poured in. No shouting, no dramaage as proof. The audience sat, stunned, silent. Mark's face went pale. This wasn't the show he had planned, and it was far from over. Then the youngest guest, stood a boy, maybe 12. Nervous and small, but burning with something inside. He cleared his throat. His French was shaky. I don't have a papa. I live in a camp. One day President Traoré came. No camera, no car, just him. Silence. I told him I wanted to be a soldier. He said, no, be a builder. Build what they tried to destroy. He gave me shoes and books. The crowd gasped. The boy pulled out a tiny, worn French book from his jacket. He gave me this, he said, his voice breaking. A tear rolled down his cheek. He gave me dreams. Music swells. Mark looked down. He had nothing left to say. Because in that studio, something greater than ratings had arrived. Truth. Mark couldn't take it anymore. The audience had shifted. They were no longer amused, they were moved, and that frightened him. He slammed his hand on the table. Enough of this emotional circus, he barked. You're a president, not a preacher. This is politics, not a sob story session. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. He looked at Mark calmly, then said, maybe you mistake power for noise. Let me show you what power really is. He pulled out a file, a live document from the Burkina Faso government. Screens behind them lit up, showing real-time reforms. Schools being reopened, farmers receiving aid. No speeches, just evidence. Mark's mouth hung open. The audience began to clap, not out of obligation, but from the soul. Backstage, an assistant was secretly recording with her phone. She caught the moment when Traoré turned to Mark and said, history won't remember insults, but it will never forget impact. Within minutes, that clip hit social media. Within an hour, it had 1 million views. By nightfall, it had reached 10 million. In Burkina Faso, young boys in villages gathered around old radios replaying every word. In France, celebrities shared the video in stunned admiration. Even critics were forced to admit this man. He didn't shout, he simply stood. People cried, watching it not out of pity, but out of pride. Finally, a leader who didn't perform, he proved. After the broadcast, Mark stormed into the green room, his hands trembling as he poured himself a glass of water. He had underestimated Ibrahim Traoré. Not just the man, but what he carried. Truth, vision, pain, hope. The door creaked open. Traoré stepped in alone, but this time Mark didn't speak. Traoré walked up to him and said softly, the world doesn't need more loud men, it needs brave ones. Then, without waiting for a reply, he left. Mark sat down slowly, looking at the now empty seat across the room. He didn't know it yet, but his life had just changed. So had millions of others. By morning, the video had reached every corner of Africa. In Ouagadougou, an elderly man wiped his eyes and whispered to his grandchildren, "That's my president." A young girl in Paris hugged her mother. "He looks like us. He speaks with heart." In Europe, the media scrambled to spin it. Some said Traoré was too emotional. Others called him dangerous. But none could deny one truth. The world had witnessed something rare, something real. The people were rising behind him. At the presidential residence in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim sat quietly with his team. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't celebrating. He was thinking, it's because something bigger had started, and it couldn't be stopped. Traoré's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, he answered. A quiet voice spoke in broken French. "Is this really you?" I don't know how to say this, but thank you. My son watched your video. Said, "Mama, I want to be like him. I've never seen him so proud." To be Burkina Faso. Ibrahim's voice cracked. He didn't say much, just 2 words. "Thank you." After the call, he looked out of his hotel window. The Eiffel Tower shone in the distance, but his heart was in Kaya, in Dori, in the dusty streets of Bobo Dioulasso. This wasn't just about TV anymore. It was about dignity. Mark hadn't slept. He rewatched the video again and again. He had mocked a man who stood for millions. He had spoken over pain, but the world didn't cancel him. They ignored him. So that hurt more. In the studio, producers whispered about replacing him. His ratings were plummeting. Then Mark made a rare decision. He went live again. No crowd. Just him. He looked into the camera and said, "I disrespected a man who represents something I didn't understand. I was arrogant. I was wrong." The clip didn't go viral, but Traoré saw it. He smiled gently, not because he had one, but because the truth had finally been heard. Across Africa, people didn't just watch the moment, they felt it. In Accra, a group of university students marched with handmade signs. "Ibrahim, you spoke." For us, in Bamako, elders sat around radios, nodding as they replayed the show. Even in refugee camps across the Sahel, children mimicked his calm tone, repeating his words with pride. Burkina Faso's streets overflowed with peaceful supporters, no protests, just pride. The same youth, once hopeless, now raised their flags. Traoré hadn't spoken for applause, but the world gave him one anyway. Not because he wanted it, but because he deserved it. A woman from the village of Fata wrote a letter to the presidency. She never expected it to be read, but it reached him. She wrote, "President Ibrahim, my son died last year during a terrorist attack. We buried him with no flag. Today I watched you on that French program. I cried not because I was sad, but because for the first time, I felt seen. Thank you for making us proud to be from this land." A grieving mother. Ibrahim held the letter for a long time before walking alone into the hotel courtyard. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "For all of them, I will not stop." 6 days after the interview, Traoré returned to Ouagadougou. No red carpet, no orchestra, just tens of thousands of people lined along the road. They weren't waving signs, just placing their right hands over their hearts, a gesture of silent respect. Even the children stood still. Ibrahim stepped out of the plane, looked at the crowd, and simply nodded. No words, no speeches. He had already said enough. That single moment, a leader walking quietly into his nation with the people behind him, became the most shared video of the year. He hadn't fought with anger. He fought with dignity. And the world listened forever. If this story moved your heart, please don't scroll away. Like this video. If you felt even a single tear, comment below with one word: respect. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that celebrate truth, dignity, and African strength. And please share this story. Let the world know that men like Ibrahim Traoré still exist. Thank you for watching. Long live courage. Long live Burkina Faso.